So, I'd like to share a few remarks as we get started with the week, and I hope you'll bear with me. 52 years ago this week, Bob Dylan recorded Ballad of a Thin Man. It only took me 3 minutes to get his name in here. Did I mention the Nobel Prize for Literature? Those of you who might know this song, Ballad of a Thin Man, knows it has a refrain to it, and the refrain is, you know something's happening here, but you don't quite know what it is. I think that sums up the world for me right now. I don't know about you, but I am feeling a little bit confused with the world right now. It wasn't that long ago, to me at least, and I'm speaking personally here, not as the Aspen Institute, that it seemed like the world was on a pretty positive track, that ever larger areas all around the globe were on their way to realizing the so-called 4 freedoms. These freedoms were first described by Franklin Roosevelt in a State of the Union address he gave in 1941. Just this past spring, Darren Walker, who I think many of you know, he's the president of the Ford Foundation, but he's also the newest judge on the John P. McNulty Prize jury. He revisited these 4 freedoms in a series of speeches that he gave across college campuses this past spring. These freedoms are the freedom of speech, the freedom of belief, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Now, I'm not naive. I couldn't know Aspen fellows like Sylvia Herrera or Yuan Li and not recognize that freedom of speech still has a ways to go in places like Guatemala and places like China, maybe even my beloved Berkeley, California, too. I couldn't know Tim El-Hadi or Shane Tegerati and not realize that freedom of belief is still under siege in places like Egypt and Iran, on trains in Portland, Oregon as well. I couldn't know Ali Mufaruqi or Manoj Kumar and not realize there's still a lot of people longing for freedom from want in places like Tanzania and India, in West Virginia and Mississippi as well. And I couldn't know Lana, where is Lana? Lana Abu Hishla, or Bill Browder, who's not with us today because he's in Washington testifying, but I couldn't know those two without recognizing that freedom from fear is still elusive in places like Palestine and Russia. And yes, in Fresno too, I think, and in St. Paul, and in Walter's hometown of New Orleans, and my own hometown of Baltimore. And yet, in just the past few years, thanks to the hard work of so many, including many of you in this room, it seemed to me that the trend lines of progress were on an upward slope. Headlines, armed conflicts between sovereign states at historic lows. 1 billion people, 500 million of them in China alone, lifted out of poverty. Online platforms democratizing education around the world. Renewable energy on the rise. Same-sex marriage legalized. And then suddenly, it's as if the sands have shifted. Now, I'm an optimist by nature. I'm convinced that the glass is half full, and I choose to continue to believe that. But I'm more than a little bit confused, and I don't think I'm the only one. And so the timing of this, Linda and Stuart, of the 2017 Resnick Aspen Action Forum could not be better. I believe that the reason why we are more of us than we've ever been for this gathering is that more than a few of us need this moment to just be still, to exhale, and to think. And since Skip Battle always reminds us that reading alone is as bad as drinking alone, it's wonderful that we can be still and think together. Just since we'd last gathered last year, and I was up talking to you last year, I've sat with fellows all over the world, which is one of the great privileges of my job. I sat with fellows like Jianyu Zhang in Beijing to hear about China's really impressive moves with Europe now, not with the US, to curb carbon emissions. But I also heard from other fellows about troubling new political developments in places like Hong Kong. In London, I was traveling with Jennifer Simpson, the managing director of our Finance Leaders Fellowship. I attended a dinner and heard of all sorts of exciting things that our fellows who live in London, people like Sean Hinton and Toby Koppel, were up to. But it didn't take too long till the table conversation turned to Brexit and to things like, at that time, the elections coming up in France, which lots of people were nervous about. In Greenville, South Carolina, with Rima Khan and with Michelle Wilver, we met with our health innovators. And we sat around the table talking about some truly amazing technologies that are out there in the medical field right now. On the way out here, my wife Denise and my daughter Eva traveled cross-country to visit colleges, and we stopped at Washington University in St. Louis, and we visited with a guy named Eric Luthart, who's one of our health innovators. And we saw these incredible things that he's doing. He calls them neuroprosthetics. I'm not smart enough to know what that means, but these are medical devices that respond directly to brain waves. It was amazing to see the sort of work that Eric and many others in our Health Innovators Fellowship are doing. But we also started talking about things like another technology that you've probably heard of called CRISPR, a technology that suddenly gives us the ability to tinker with the human genome, with genes and living cells, and according to some, to control evolution itself. Out at Y River campus, Tanya Hinch, Skip, and I sat with our Henry Crown Fellows talking about all the mind-boggling accelerations in artificial intelligence, in automation. But we also asked, what does this mean for the factory workers, for the truck drivers, for the mortgage brokers watching their jobs and their futures diminish and maybe even disappear? The very people who turned out in large numbers around the world in elections and referenda in 2016 and 2017. Something is happening. And so we come together for the next 4 days to talk about the theme of this gathering, the Great Reset. Our goals, as always, to pause, reflect, refresh, and recommit to action. But this year in particular, what I'd like us to be doing is to inventory all the incredible changes in what our closing speaker, Tom Friedman, calls in his new book, which I can't recommend highly enough, The Age of Accelerations, which I think captures so well what we're living through. And I'd like us to be asking ourselves 3 fundamental questions over the next few days. How do we, as leaders, recalibrate to make sure that all of the tremendous changes going on around us have a net positive impact on society, that we see them as opportunities for enlightened leadership, not threats? How do we do this while remaining true to our core bedrock values? And by the way, what do we, the Aspen Global Leadership Network, and all of our invited guests here in the room, and we're all lovingly dubbed the Intergalactic Army of the Just, I must remind you, by Bernie Dunlap, who's not with us today. But how do we define what we want to be the core bedrock values of the Aspen Global Leadership Network and all of our work together? The Aspen Institute, as you saw in the film, was founded 67 years ago. There were a lot of different threads that led to the creation of what I think is an amazing institution. But 2 of them have always resonated particularly deeply with me. The first thread was the idea of creating a neutral place. A place for leaders from different backgrounds with different worldviews. People who, but for the Aspen Institute, probably wouldn't be sitting around a table together. To come together in civil, constructive dialogue to see if they couldn't make some headway in dealing with the most difficult challenges of our times. This gathering, just to state the obvious, is very much in that tradition of bringing together a pretty unlikely group of people, but a group of people for constructive dialogue. Lord knows we have a lot to talk about, whether it's racism or sexism or xenophobia or inequality. Did I mention that an ice shelf twice the size of Luxembourg recently broke off? We do have a lot to talk about. The second thread in our founding was the idea of humanism. This was called, until 1986, I believe, the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies. The idea that, and I'm quoting here Mortimer Adler, one of the founders of the Aspen Institute, where science has a technological or productive utility, philosophy has a moral utility. Philosophy can't tell men how to make things, but it can direct them towards making a good rather than an evil use of them. It directs the conduct of the individual life and of society itself by the moral truths it's able to teach us about justice, liberty, duty, virtue, and happiness. In other words, in the very founding of the Aspen Institute was the idea of asking perhaps one of the most difficult questions we can ask of hard-charging leaders. And that question is, just because we can, does that mean we should? At the time of our founding, this question had to do with things like the deployment of atomic energy, had to do with things like the deployment of what were considered miracle chemicals. I saw this amazing special Denise and I were watching about Rachel Carson, of course, the mother of the modern environmental movement, and I was amazed to see that in the 1950s there were television commercials encouraging moms to sprinkle their kids' hair with DDT to keep the bugs away. And so nobody really was asking the questions until the Aspen Institute came along. Just because we can produce these so-called miracle things, does that mean we should deploy them? Today, it's a question that seems worth asking about a lot of different things. Just because we can close borders to stem the tide of people, does that mean that we should? Just because we can splice genes and extend life to 150, does that mean it's a good idea and that we should? Just because we can automate all sorts of jobs, does it mean that we should? The list goes on. We're going to ask ourselves these questions and more in the coming days. As we do that, I ask that we do so with humility and with civility. I want to be very, very clear here. There are those in this room and all across the Aspen Global Leadership Network who feel that the world is moving in exactly the wrong direction. There are also people in this room and the Aspen Global Leadership Network who feel that it's moving in the right direction. In between are those who aren't quite sure, but who also can't believe that more of us didn't see the great disruptions that we're now experiencing coming down the tracks, especially since in hindsight, so many of the causes were right there in front of us in plain view. We need to respect all of these viewpoints. As I said to a group this morning, this is called the Great Reset, but this isn't about resetting everybody else. This is about us resetting. Your goal here is not to reset everybody else in the room. Darren Walker, the president of the Ford Foundation, who I mentioned earlier, talked about this in one of his commencement addresses this year. He said, with freedom of speech comes a responsibility to listen. To listen, as we tell every participant at every Aspen seminar, on the very first day of the seminar, we say we need you to listen actively. Not merely to wait for that space where you can get in and rebut what the other person is saying, but to listen closely and to try to understand not just what the other person is saying, but why they've come to believe that what they're saying is true. Confucius said it best. He said, don't worry so much that others fail to understand you. Worry that you fail to understand others. To those of you here today feeling some trepidation about sharing your views, lest they be unpopular, let me repeat what we also say at the beginning of every Aspen seminar. If you feel that the tide of conversation is going in a direction that makes you uncomfortable, it's your duty. It's your responsibility to speak up. It's going to be uncomfortable. I do it all the time. I know how uncomfortable it can get, but it's why you're here. It's why you're part of this network, and it's why you're at this gathering. And I know this. In speaking up, you will be a source of learning for others, whether you know it or not. I've mentioned Darren Walker a few times. I want to close this part of my remarks by mentioning him again. He was, as I said, elaborating in a series of speeches on Franklin Roosevelt's 4 freedoms. And he didn't just say with freedom of speech comes a responsibility to listen. He said with freedom of belief comes a responsibility to accept one another with empathy, to fight off our reflexive push towards exclusion and to embrace inclusion, not to deny or ignore our differences, oh, they're very real, but to recognize and to celebrate them. With freedom from want, he said, comes a responsibility to serve others. Let's be honest, there are very few people in this room who suffer from true want. And if we're humble enough to admit that, I hope we're equally humble enough to accept that it's probably because people in our lives took the initiative to help and to sacrifice for us. So it's up to us to do the same with respect with care for the true needs and the dignity of others, and as Brian Stevenson admonished us last year up on the stage, in true proximity, not from a sterile distance. Darren's last lesson for us is this: with freedom from fear comes, appropriately for us here today, the responsibility to act, to oppose those who would spread fear, to defend the vulnerable, to live with integrity and courage and compassion, to avoid becoming comfortably numb in these our privileged enclaves, lest we become the ones that future generations, like my daughter over there in the action camp, I don't want her to be asking me, where were you when your neighbors needed you? Civility, inclusion, empathy, humility, service, integrity, courage, compassion, action. Not the full list of values that I hope prevails in this network, but not such a bad start either. Welcome to the 2017 Resnick Aspen Action Forum. The glass is half full. Abdication is not an option. The world needs courageous, entrepreneurial, optimistic, and perhaps most importantly, joyful leaders who are ready to lean in and to act. I think I know where to find at least 2,500 of them.